to do about it? It's a good title because it's going to help us maybe make a personal application to today's message, which will be coming entirely from the Book of Esther, if you'd be turning there. Book of Esther is an interesting book. It's one of the only books in the Bible that doesn't actually make any direct mentioning of God. You get the essence of his presence all around it, and it talks about his people, but he doesn't get specifically mentioned. And here in the Book of Esther, starting off in chapter 1, which we won't read, but I will summarize, we're going to see the same characters that we saw in the skit. There is a bully, there is a victim, there is an observer, and then there is an advisor. As the bully went about harassing poor Nolan, unchecked, Nolan wasn't sure what to do. He went from hungry, let's eat, to not too sure if he could have confidence in his lunch. And once the observer saw what was happening, she could tell right away that something was off about the situation. Something was taking place that was wrong. But she wondered what she was supposed to do about it. And that's a question I think some of us come to in our own lives at times. We see something that's not quite right, and we wonder, what am I supposed to do about it?
Right.
Oftentimes, we just sort of let it pass by because of our uncertainty.
Right.
Other times, we may have the courage to get involved a little bit, but back down at the first sign of trouble. But there is one element that we have available to us as Christians, which can take things to a whole new level, and that is the element of faith. See, when we believe that what we're doing is God's calling in our life, that it is a God-ordained action that we're taking, that He has identified to us through His advisor, which we call the Holy Spirit, or which we might refer to as the Scriptures, or what we might get encouraged by this faith community to do, we are more confident that we're not just intervening for some social purpose, but we're intervening because it is God's will for us to do so. And on faith, we feel like not intervening would actually be the wrong thing to do. So we're compelled to act. What we're going to read about in the Book of Esther today is a decision to have faith or to not have faith. What could have happened next? In the skit, if Kylie gets involved, the bully could have turned on her.
Right.
He could have made her his next target, right? He could have decided to pick something out to make fun of and included her as an additional part of his bullying. But what you'll notice is he didn't do that. Most bullies won't. Most bullies will back down when someone has the courage and the faith to stand for what's right. Let me ask you a question to ponder here. Can the plans of God, if they really are the plans of God, be thwarted? Can the plans of God really ever be pushed aside or beaten if they really are the plans of God? Now here's a question I'd love to get some participation on. Think about this and respond if you would. What happens to the people who decide to align themselves with the plans of God? What happens to these people in your experience, in your observation? Logan? They have an uncanny tendency to succeed. Yeah. Other thoughts? What happens when people align themselves with the plans of God? Tony?
It can bring negative heat from the folks that have aligned themselves against the plans of God. And there are many of those.
Yeah.
Those people.
It can bring some heat, can it? In the back there, Devisha. I'm sorry, I didn't hear you. They're more joyous? Okay, so yeah, they might have a little bit more of a happiness to them because they feel like they're on to something big. Aaron?
To go with Tony, they're noticed.
Okay.
For positive and negative.
Yeah.
Depending on which
You get noticed. Good or bad. Gina, one more. Okay, yeah, we all have to do difficult things sometimes. And they're more at peace when they know that they're doing the difficult thing because they've got the backing of the Almighty, right? Let's turn our Bibles there to the book of Esther. Esther is another great example, by the way. We've done this several times this year. We've talked about Old Testament types of Messiah, okay? Esther's not a Messiah in the flesh, just born in a different place and time. She's a type of Messiah. She's kind of a prelude. And there's certain parallels between the life of Jesus and the life of Esther that we'll pick up on here in the story. She's a foreshadowing to the work and the function of Jesus, even though it never mentions the Messiah, as I mentioned earlier, in any direct way. So just be on the lookout for those parallels between Esther and the Messiah as we read through our story today. Chapter 1 tells us about a Persian king named Xerxes. And he was the supreme ruler in charge of a vast empire, the Persian Empire, starting in about 486 BC, before the time of Jesus. And he had a wife. She was the queen named Vashti. And perhaps for good reason, she slighted him publicly once at a party.
Yes.
And he got pretty mad. And so he used his kingly powers to have his very own wife banished from the kingdom because she dared to slight him and not honor one of his requests. So what happened was there was this feast. It was a 7-day long feast, and there was a lot of drinking toward the end of the feast. Some crescendo of beverage consumption had taken place, and the king and his guys were maybe not in their right mind, and he asked her to come into his presence. Come before me, queen. And she declined. She didn't want to go. Maybe she was afraid of being treated immodestly or objectified. But she said, no, I'm not coming. So he acted rashly, and he had her banished from the kingdom. In chapter 2, we see that Vashti had to be replaced. Got to have a queen. Got a king, got to have a queen. Right? So he looks for another queen, and they search the land, and they have a bit of a beauty contest. And the winner of the beauty contest is going to have the honor of becoming the new queen. And somewhat hesitantly, there is an Israelite woman named Hadassah who gets her name changed to Esther. She becomes a participant in this contest, and you know what happens? She wins. She's a beautiful girl, and she becomes the next queen. And her uncle, named Mordecai, just happened to have some position working in the courtyard of the king. Maybe he was a gardener, maybe he was a gatekeeper, a maintenance guy, whatever he was, he had some position in the courtyard of the king. And while he was there in the courtyard working, he overheard some of the other officials in Persia talking about something scandalous. They were like, you know what we should do? We should get rid of the Xerxes guy. Maybe we could poison him. Maybe we could drop a big rock on his head and claim it was an accident, but maybe we could sneak up on him while he's sleeping and assassinate him, but he's got to go. And Mordecai overheard him. And he decided to say something about it, and it was reported to the king, and the plot was uncovered, and Xerxes was safe. And we'll get back to a little bit more about that plot later. So Mordecai had done this thing to save the king's life, and now Mordecai's niece was the queen. This is kind of the build-up as we begin to read here in chapter 3. Can I get a volunteer to read for us verses 1 through 6? 1 through 6. Jenna's going to do it in Malachi chapter, I'm sorry, not Malachi. Yeah, in Esther chapter 3. 1 through 6.
Later, the king promoted Haman, the son of Hammedatha, to the highest position
So, as things begin to unfold here, we are introduced to a character named Haman. He's going to be the main bully in our story. And he's rising up in the ranks of Persia. He's becoming more and more important. And you know the worst thing that you can do to somebody who's already arrogant? Is give them a compliment. Right? If they're already struggling with their ego, another compliment tends to just add gasoline to the fire. And beyond the compliment, what does Haman get? He gets promoted. He's given a position of authority. How many of you ever had the honor of working for a very arrogant person? And that's your supervisor or boss. Isn't that fun? Just love that work environment. Right? Look forward to going to work for the arrogant guy or the arrogant lady who you can't tell anything to. They already know everything. Well, this is Haman. And so when everybody sees him coming, they're bowing in respect. And Mordecai decides, I'm not going to bow to this guy. I'm just not. Something about him makes me feel wrong about bowing in respect. I don't respect him. I don't want to be phony about it. I'm going to stand. I'm literally going to stand up. And this catches the attention of Haman and bothers him. Can I get another volunteer to read verses 8 through 10 here? Nathan's going to read 8 through 10. Thanks, buddy. Awesome. So, in my mind, if you ever see the movie Aladdin, Haman is kind of like Jafar.
Yeah.
Big time.
Right? He's kind of got the twisted beard and he's up to something.
Yeah.
Right? He's up to something. Not that Xerxes was, a pure individual either, but Haman reports this disrespect to the king and says, it really would not just be bad for me, but it'd be bad for the king if this kind of thing were tolerated. This lack of respect being shown for someone that you have appointed to an important place. Disrespecting me is kind of like disrespecting you. Tell you what I'm going to do. I'll give you some money. I'll put it into the treasury and I'll fund this whole thing myself. But you should really come up with some sort of extermination plan for this guy and all of his family and people. We should get rid of all these kind of people. I'll even pay for it. The king says, keep your money. Just take my signet ring, which was kind of like a stamp on a ring, and then they would make a wax seal. They would drip some wax onto an official document. The king would punch his ring into the wax, and it would make a little, mold that it was like his signature. It was really official, right? He says, just take my signet ring and let's just make it happen, Captain. Let's get rid of these Israelites, just as you said. All right, we're going to read a little bit more. Chapter 4. In chapter 4 of Esther, in verse 1, it reads as follows. When Mordecai learned of all that had been done, he tore his clothes. Not because he was angry necessarily, but that was a symbol or a sign of grief or mourning. And put on sackcloth and ashes. Sackcloth is a really coarse, cheap fabric that the poorer people would typically be relegated to wearing because it was all they could afford. And to put that on was to make yourself humbled and low. And the ashes he would sprinkle on his head were that same type of ornament. Make yourself look lowly. So he then went into the city wailing loudly. Oh, this is bad. This is terrible. He was weeping bitterly. But he went only as far as the king's gate, because you couldn't bring that stuff inside of the king's courtyard. The king's courtyard was a happy place. Keep your social justice issues outside of the king's gate, please. We're going to be only smiley and only neat and tidy in here. In every province in which the edict and order of the king came, there was great mourning amongst the Jews. No one else was really worried about it because they weren't the ones being exterminated.
Right.
There was fasting, there was weeping, there was wailing. Many lay in sackcloth and ashes. You can imagine going around the city of Oshkosh or Appleton or Green Bay or wherever you live and just seeing all sorts of people dressed down and looking sad and crying. You would wonder,
Right.
what's happening?
Sure.
This is bad. Whatever this is bad. When Esther's eunuchs and female attendants, verse 4 says, came and told her about Mordecai, she was in great distress. She sent clothes for him to put on instead of the sackcloth. But he wouldn't accept them. She was kind of like, hey, I'll go, Mordecai. Just put on the nice clothes and get in the courtyard and just let it go. Then Esther summoned Hathach, one of the king's eunuchs, and assigned him to attend her, and ordered him, or that was assigned to attend her, and ordered him to find out why Mordecai was troubled. So Hathach went out to Mordecai in the open square of the city, in front of the king's gate, and Mordecai told him everything that had happened, including the exact amount of money that Haman had promised to pay to the royal treasury for the destruction of the Jews. He also gave him a copy of the text of the edict for their annihilation, which had been published in Susa, to show Esther and to explain it to her, and told him to instruct her to go into the king's presence and beg the king for mercy and plead with him for her people. So Mordecai says, here's proof. Take the document to her, explain to her what's happening, and tell her, we need you.
Right.
You're the one. Like Kylie had to be the one in the skit today. You're the voice. Hathach went back and reported to Esther what Mordecai had said. Then she instructed him to say to Mordecai, so she sent the message back, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned there first by the king has but one law. And that law is that they be put to death unless the king happens to hold out his gold scepter to them and say, it's okay for you to be here. I approve it. I'll spare your life. And I got to be honest, she says in verse 11, it's been 30 days that have passed since I've been called to the king. I'm not all that shiny in his eyes anymore. When Esther's words were reported back to Mordecai, he sent her back this answer. So when we look at Esther's words to Mordecai, by the way, what do we see here in Esther's message back to Mordecai? What do we witness? Keith, fear. She's afraid. Why is she afraid? What happened to his last wife?
Yeah. Banished.
Wow.
She was banished. For what? Just a sign of disrespect. That was all. Was it a sign of disrespect to come before the king without him asking for you first? It was. According to law, it was.
Right.
So she's like, hey, the last lady that disrespected the king got banished. I don't think this is a good idea at all. So she's kind of making alibis or excuses. We pick back up here. Would someone please read verses 12 through 17 here in chapter 4, Tony?
When Esther's words were reported to Mordecai, he sent back the answer, do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place, but you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this." Then Esther sent this reply to Mordecai: "Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish." So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
All right, thank you, Tony. Here's where we find the big to-do of this whole story.
Right.
Okay? Specifically between verses 11 and 14. Esther's got a choice. Stand up and be brave and tell that kid to eat his own lunch. Or wonder, what could I do about it? I'm just some random girl in the cafeteria. I'm not going to say anything because I don't want to be next. Esther's choice to either play it safe personally or help her endangered people is at the center of this story.
Right.
And there was that law that was in existence that stated Persian kings really only surrounded themselves with their inner court, their ministers, and their favorite people. And Esther wasn't a part of that. She was a part of probably a stash of concubines and or queens who served at the king's leisure and came into his presence only when he asked for them.
It kind of shows like one in the sketch who kind of being a bully by criticizing the other way. And the girl was like, "Hey, eat yours, don't mind what you do."
So she's got this choice to make, and an entrance into the presence of the king without an invitation would be viewed as inappropriate, and she knew it. So she tried to excuse her way out of it. Mordecai says, "Look, don't think that you're going to get out of this thing scot-free just because you're the queen. If you don't stand up to him, God will. And he'll send somebody else. But God will stand up for what's right. Always. He'd prefer, perhaps, to use you. Maybe
Right.
it is for such a time as this that you've come into the position that you currently occupy, Esther." So she thinks about it, and in this crucial moment, after what Uncle Mordecai points out, she decides to surrender herself to the process, and in faith, she says, "Okay, I'm going to do it for the good of my people." So she fasts and she prays. And all of us have these kind of decisions to make in our life sometimes, big decisions. And we all use some sort of decision-making pattern, right?
Yeah.
When it comes to how we're going to spend our money, or how we're going to seek out our vacations, or spend our time, or the things that might impact our education or our children. We have a decision-making pattern that we use, right? I hope you do. If not, you should get one. Right? And Esther has a decision-making pattern, and we see from her that it's a spiritual one. She prays and she fasts, and she makes her decision based upon the plans of God. That's a great example she sets for us. We see that same thing in the Garden of Gethsemane, don't we?
Yes.
Jesus has the potential, the high potential for personal harm in his path. And how does he prepare for it? He does so in prayer. So she surrenders herself to the authorities for the good of others. And we pick back up here in chapter 5. And in verse 1, it says, "On the third day, Esther put on her royal robes, stood in the inner court of the palace in front of the king's hall. The king was sitting in his royal throne in the hall and facing the entrance. And when he saw Queen Esther standing in the court," here it comes. He didn't invite her. It says he was pleased. Whew. And held out the gold scepter that was in his hand. And essentially said, "Come on in. Good to see you." So Esther approached. She touched the tip of the scepter. Everything was safe for the moment. Then the king asked, "What is it, Queen Esther? What is your request?" even up to half of the kingdom. She must have been looking really nice that day. Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be given to you. Well, if it pleases the king, replied Esther, let the king together with Haman come today to a banquet that I've prepared. She doesn't say right away, hey, protect the Jews. She's got an idea. She says, I'm going to throw a little banquet. I would like you and your friend Haman to attend. Bring Haman at once, the king said, so that we may do what Esther asks. So the king and Haman went to the banquet that Esther prepared. As they were drinking wine, the king again asked Esther, now, what is your petition? It'll be given to you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom, it'll be granted. Esther replied, my petition and my request is this. If the king regards me with favor, and if it pleases the king to grant my position and fulfill my request, then let the king and Haman over here come again tomorrow to a banquet I will prepare for them. And then I will answer the king's question. Haman went out that day. Remember, he's already arrogant, right?
Right.
Now he's gotten a special invite 2 days in a row to a banquet from the queen. She mentioned him by name. He's feeling happy, it says in verse 9. He's in high spirits. But when he saw Mordecai at the king's gate and observed that he neither rose nor showed fear in his presence, he was filled with rage against Mordecai. He went from feeling happy to sad. Nevertheless, he restrained himself and went home, calling together his friends and Zeresh, his wife. He boasted to them about his wealth, about his many sons, about all the ways the king had been honoring him, and how he had been elevated above the other nobles and officials. And that's not all. Haman added, I am the only person Queen Esther invited to accompany the king to a banquet that she gave. And she has invited me along with the king again tomorrow. I'm a big deal. How come this Mordecai guy can't see it? I'm important.
Right.
And it says in verse 13, but all this gives me no satisfaction as long as I see that Jew, Mordecai, sitting when I walk by at the king's gate. So his wife and Zeresh all say to him, hey, look, you know what you got to do? Make a really big gallows, tall, so everybody can see it no matter where they're standing in town, and hang him from it. And he's like, okay, great idea. That's what I'll do. And then in chapter 6, something interesting happens. God brings a restless night of sleep to King Xerxes. Xerxes has a difficult time getting his brain to shut down and get rest. And so he does what a lot of people do. He says, hey, read me a boring history book. Right? So he asks some of his servants to bring out the annals of the king, and they begin to read the history of Xerxes' time as king of Persia. And in the history, they come across that assassination plot from earlier. And they mention in the annals how Mordecai, Esther's uncle, was the guy who had stopped Xerxes from being assassinated. And Xerxes says, hey, did we ever do anything nice for that guy? Did we get him some flowers or a card, a thank you card? Anything? Because it kind of saved my life there. Did we ever do anything nice for him? And the officials are like, well, not yet. We haven't done anything nice for him yet. And Xerxes says, oh yeah, that's what we got to do. Get that Mordecai guy and let's do something nice to honor him. Let's honor the man who saved my life. It's just that moment that Xerxes is thinking of how he could honor Mordecai that Haman shows back up in chapter 6. And he's getting ready to suggest to the king, guess what? That they hang Mordecai.
Yeah.
So here, in a little thought bubble attached to Xerxes' brain, is honor Mordecai. And in comes Haman with a little thought bubble attached to his brain, which is kill Mordecai.
Right.
And something else happens here. He learns that the king wants to honor Mordecai, and he asks Haman, his buddy, his trusted friend, he says, hey Haman, this guy saved my life. I want you to honor him. By the way, his name is Mordecai. He's that guy that sits by the gate and doesn't bow to you. Haman is angry, disappointed to say the least. But the man he hated so much was the one that the king wanted to honor. So we pick things back up here in chapter 7. Another interesting parallel between this story and the story of Jesus is that a public execution that was meant to be interpreted as a way to extinguish God's people is going to be turned around, turned on its head as a way to save God's people. Chapter 7, verse 3. If I could get a volunteer to read verses 3 through 10, Ivy's going to do that for us.
Then Queen Esther answered, if I have found favor with you, O king, and if it pleases your majesty, grant me my life. This is my petition. And spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold for destruction and slaughter and annihilation. If we have merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king. King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, who is he? Where is the man who dared to do such a thing? Esther said, the adversary, an enemy, is this vile Haman. Then Haman was terrified before the queen and the king. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as...
I'm sorry.
Oh, how far do you want me to go?
Do that.
Okay. Just as the king entered from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, will he even molest the queen while he is with me in the house? As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs tending the king, said, a gallows 75 feet high stands by Haman's house. He has made it for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king. The king said, hang him on it. So they hanged Haman on the gallows he had prepared for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided.
Thank you. All right, one more section here, just a short one. Chapter 8, another volunteer, verses 1 through 8. Chapter 8, Aaron's going to read verses 1 through 8.
That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, the enemy of the Jews. Mordecai came into the presence of the king for Esther had told how he was related to her. The king took off his signet ring, which he had reclaimed from Haman, and presented it to Mordecai, and Esther appointed him over Haman's estate. Esther again pleaded with the king, falling at his feet and weeping. She begged him to put an end to the evil plan of Haman and Mordecai, which he had devised against the Jews. Then the king extended the gold scepter to Esther, and she arose and stood before him. If it pleases the king, she said, and if he regards me with favor, and thinks it the right thing to do, and if he is pleased with me, let an order be written overruling the dispatches that Haman, son of Mattha, and the Agagite devised and wrote to destroy the Jews in all the king's provinces. For how can I bear to see disaster fall on my people? How can I bear to see the destruction of my family? King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have hanged him on the gallows. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as it seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signature. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring
Thank you. So Esther goes for it, right? She risks things, and she points out Haman, or Haman, right? And she says, this is the guy who came up with the plan to exterminate my people, and this is the guy who wanted to kill Mordecai. In that moment, what could the king have done? Who was Haman to the king?
Good friend.
A good friend.
Right.
Yeah. A trusted advisor. So to implicate him as suddenly the bad guy in the plot would be quite shocking to the king. Esther didn't have probably nearly as close of a relationship
Yeah.
as Haman did to the king. Now, I'm not sure that they were, pals who went out to the pub and drank a pint together. That's not probably how it worked in the Persian Empire, but he had a lot more time and a lot more trust and currency built up with the king than she did. Nevertheless, she puts herself out there and she explains the dilemma and she implicates Haman as the bad guy, and God comes through on her behalf and for her people, which is what God does with those who align themselves with his plan. God comes through. This is a very grand way that he comes through. Sometimes it's in a much more muted form, oftentimes. But God will come through for those who stand up for what's right. And this backfires on Haman pretty bad, right? Haman had just built this gallows. He built it specifically for Mordecai. And within the hour, guess who's hanging on him?
He is.
Yeah.
He is. He essentially built his own destruction, which is really what Satan did.
Right.
He probably thought along the way that as Jesus was being arrested and offered up for crucifixion, Satan was probably very excited and thinking, this is a good thing, okay, this public execution, this is what's going to silence the voice of God, this is what's going to doom mankind, this Messiah thing isn't going to work out. And instead, what did Jesus do by going to the cross and dying for our sins? He saved us. It was through that execution that we have been brought the opportunity to be redeemed. Pretty amazing. So, in conclusion here, God comes through, and all this results in a backfire on the bad guys and the bullies. And Esther's selfless courage is what makes the difference. One young girl stands up in faith and makes a difference. In chapter 9, God's people are called to commemorate this amazing event with an annual holiday called Purim, from the Hebrew word for pur or lot. And during this time that they celebrate, they exchange gifts with each other. There's a time of great joy. And those who opposed God's people were dealt with by an edict from the king himself very decisively. In chapter 10, which is the final chapter, Mordecai is held in high honor, and he actually gets elevated to a place of authority that used to belong to Haman. He's got Haman or Haman's old job.
Right.
It's very ironic. It certainly reminds us of how the adversaries of God attempt to gain power by silencing Jesus, only to inadvertently exalt him to the place of King of Kings. Mordecai is a good example in not bowing to fear, one that we would be wise to follow.
Amen.
And we can do that each time we do the simple, right thing in faith. Esther's life is portrayed in this book as a type of Messiah. Like I said, it reminds us of Jesus' faithful decision to trust God and save people. Practically speaking, what I would want each of us to do is ask yourself a question before you go to bed tonight. Ask yourself a question: what is God calling me to do to get involved in his plan? Is it help a poor person that you know of? Is it to befriend a lonely person at school or at work? Is it to disciple a wayward soul who you know is going in the wrong direction? Is it to get involved with a specific community need? or engage more deeply in the ministry and spreading of the gospel. Any of those things is going to create a risk for you. But accepting risk as an act of faith is a good thing to do. We talked last week about faith, didn't we? Faith is living and active rather than theoretical and dead. And when we take a risk in accordance with our faith, we're living our faith rather than just talking about it. Because we all have to answer the question sometimes, what am I supposed to do about it? Amen? Before Robert comes